Well, good evening, everyone. This is Tim Ashe, President of the Vermont State Senate, here on April 30th with my nightly update on the COVID-19 crisis and Vermont's response. In a few seconds, I'm going to turn to a very special guest who can talk about the special challenges facing homeless Vermonters and people who are at risk of homelessness, and what the people who work in that field professionally are doing to meet the needs in this particularly complex moment. But want to give a few updates before we turn to our guest. And the first, I'm going to start with a somewhat philosophical or poetic note. Someone reminded me today of one of the classic T.S. Eliot poems, which begins, and I have to read it because I unfortunately am not someone who memorizes verse. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. And today, I think the idea that April is the cruelest month, April has definitely been a pretty cruel month, both for Vermont, but for the whole world facing this crisis. And you know, with the morning rain that we had in Burlington, where I live, it just made me reflect on how difficult it has been for the last month and a half, operating under these new normal conditions, but also with some sense of hope as we look ahead to May and to the summer. And if our collective effort to suppress this virus continues to be successful, then there's hope on the other side of this and not despair. So there's my T.S. Eliot for the evening. The second thing I want to let you know is that tomorrow the Senate will be having a virtual floor session. So this is available on the web on our YouTube streaming channel at 10:30 a.m. And the bill that we're going to be taking up is a hazard pay bill. So that's a term that many people have been using across the country when we think about pay boosts for people who are in particular sectors. One of the things that's been very important to many of us in the Vermont Senate, and I know many in the House as well, has been that there are people who are really in high contact jobs that don't pay a lot of money and otherwise will get no real meaningful boost. And as a result, in some instances, people who are continuing to show up for work every day are making less money than someone in a very comparable job, but who may be out of work collecting unemployment. And it's not about blaming the person who's on unemployment, but we thought that something had to be done to recognize the extra efforts that are being made and the extra stress and risk associated with many workers who are in fields where they're coming in frequent contact with customers or others. And tomorrow, the Senate will be advancing legislation that tries to address that for approximately 30,000 Vermonters. In some ways, what it is a recognition that for many employees who have no one else bargaining for them to help get an economic reward for the particular risks that they've taken on these last 6 weeks, that we're operating under the assumption that the legislature is going to have to be the person stepping up and effectively bargaining on their behalf. So that's at 10:30. I hope you'll check that out. And then at 2:30 tomorrow, also on the legislature's YouTube channel, which I'll add the links underneath this after we're done tonight, Mark Levine, the Commissioner of Health, will be speaking to the entire Senate in a slightly more informal setting about the new initiative around expanded testing for COVID-19 and contact tracing. These are both critical elements of our path out of the current restrictions and stay-at-home order. And so that promises to be an interesting discussion, and anyone who wishes to watch in real time is welcome to do that. And as I say, I'll provide that link so that people can easily find it for 2:30 tomorrow. Now we can turn to our guest tonight, and I want to introduce Rhianna Kendrick from Groundworks Collaborative down in Brattleboro. Good evening.
Hi, Tim. Thanks.
Well, thanks for joining me tonight. I think that one of the things that has been obvious during this crisis is that it's hard enough for people who have, under typical circumstances, relative stability in their life, the roof over their head, enough money saved up so that they can ride out a little bit of this downturn, food in the cupboards and in the refrigerator. And I think there is a general recognition that for people who cannot say that they have those elements of security, that this is a particularly difficult time. And I know that you and your coworkers are right in the thick of addressing those kinds of Vermonters' needs. So you work at Groundworks Collaborative, which for people outside the Brattleboro area might sound like some kind of anarchist farm collective. But why don't you tell us a little bit just about what Groundworks Collaborative is about and what your particular workplace is like there in normal times, and then we'll talk about what it's been like under COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely. Normal being such a relative term. So Groundworks is the agency, or a nonprofit agency in the greater Brattleboro area that supports folks with food, shelter, and supportive services. And so through things like a food shelf, through an emergency shelter, through a winter warming shelter, we have case managers who provide support to folks in the community to do things like obtain housing, to make sure that they can successfully maintain housing, finding employment and working on income. We have a representative payee program where we help folks who receive Social Security funds manage those funds successfully. So all sorts of services along the gamut that are aimed at supporting people in sustaining, particularly focused on housing.
So in my neck of the woods, would COTS be a comparable organization?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, very similar to a lot of the work that COTS is doing.
And Brattleboro being effectively in a 3-state sort of corner, you got near neighbors with Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Generally speaking, are predominantly Vermonters being served? Is it a little bit of a mix? What is the typical group of individuals you work with?
We get that question a lot, especially in terms of homeless populations and who do you serve and where do folks come from. And I would say predominantly in our shelter programs, the folks that we see are folks from the Brattleboro area and from beyond that, from the Vermont area, with some folks who move around a bit. And then through our food shelf, we certainly serve kind of a broader cross-section of folks. And so it's not unusual to see someone who kind of pops in from a surrounding area where there may not be a food shelf that's up and running. So
largely Vermonters, and then a little bit of spillover when people's lives happen to lead them, across a state line, which when you're meeting your basic needs is a artificial line ultimately.
Yep. Yeah. State boundaries don't matter when you don't have housing or food.
For sure. Well, so you've already got a normally stressful job because you're dealing with people often who are in either some level of crisis or certainly a heightened level of need. And that, can you say a little bit about when things started to change as it relates to COVID-19? What were the early warning signs, if you will, that something additional was being layered onto the normal stresses facing people that you serve?
Sure. I think we kind of watched, and our leadership team talked a lot about what things were looking like in the broader sense all around us without having a lot of context for what it meant in Brattleboro and in Vermont. And it's particularly memorable because we had a conversation on March 12th, which would have been a Thursday morning. Our leadership team meets and we talked about what are the changes, what are the things that we need to put in place, and still felt largely like things were happening and things were changing, but it hadn't impacted us as directly. And by the end of that day, we found out that we had providers who had been on site who had been exposed while they had been traveling the week prior. And so we went from kind of watching and prepping a bit to full crisis response mode, where we were really looking at who was impacted and what were the changes that we needed to make. And then that following weekend was when we received guidance through the state that we could start moving folks who were deemed hyper vulnerable. So over the age of 60 or with underlying medical conditions, kind of from our shelter locations into motel rooms. And so that first weekend spent time doing that. And I feel like, that first weekend kind of kicked off all of the things that began next in terms of where we were housing folks and how we were housing folks and and we haven't stopped since.
I bet. So on that Thursday, and the dates, I'm normally pretty bad with dates, but I know that Friday the 13th was the day we voted to close the State House, both for our own work and visitation and all that. So on the 12th, you found out that some of your coworkers may have been exposed to people who were positive tests.
Yeah, positive, yeah.
Did that mean that they were immediately taken out of commission in terms of being part of the team, at least in those first days?
Yeah, so there was a couple of folks who immediately self-quarantined, and then, of course, in the realm of monitoring symptoms for everyone else. And certainly when we moved to restrict visitors to our program and kind of limit contact, that was really when that kind of began for us.
And what was it like I know that weekend when you tried starting to move people over out of shelter spaces into motel beds. The schools had not yet closed down. That was a few days away. Childcare facilities had not closed down. That was still a little bit away. Restaurants and bars still open. Yep. So, how did that feel when you were being directed very quickly to shift the whole operation, at least in terms of housing people, when around you, things were still, people were stressed and there was some anxiety about what might happen next, but generally speaking, people were still out, going to the grocery store. There was no rush on toilet paper at that point. All the things we've come to expect in recent weeks. Life was still relatively normal, at least the way people were living it. Did it have any sense that you were almost like in a parallel universe?
It did, and through a lot of this, it really has continued to. I mean, we moved the folks that were what we would consider most vulnerable without having a plan of what we were doing. And so we were, we had staff supporting moving folks to motels at 10 o'clock at night on Saturday and had to figure out how we were feeding those folks for 8 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. And so it was just a bizarre sense of the challenges that we were facing and what was going to come next. And even the following Saturday was when we closed our warming shelter and moved 19 folks to a local motel. And even that day, it was beautiful and sunny, and folks were outside playing Frisbee together. And so to go from that to, by the end of the evening, having everyone moved into motel rooms was such a drastic change. And I say that as a staff member, organizing and working through those steps and can't even begin to sort of fathom the impact on the folks that we were moving and how that felt, which I think was really scary in a lot of ways.
Have people who've been moved into motels, I assume they're still there. We're 6 weeks later.
Sure.
Have some come and gone? Are most of the folks that you moved into motel settings still in the same room that they've been in? And what's it been like? I mean, typically I'm imagining that you offer additional services. It's not just a clean and safe place to spend the night. It's additional services. Yeah. So say a little bit about whether people have been in and out or they've just been hunkered down, and what it's been like to try to meet their broader needs.
Sure. So we, as I said, we had just under 10 people that first weekend, 19 folks the second weekend. At this point, we have a little over 100 hotel rooms where folks are staying in the community. So we have the bulk of folks kind of across 3 motel rooms. We certainly have seen some folks come and go. We've continued to house folks with landlords in the community, particularly through our local housing trust. And have seen a lot of new people come in, not unfamiliar folks to us, but folks that might have been in precarious housing situations who, as things have become more challenging and people are trying to distance appropriately, there's certainly been an increase in folks needing housing. We also see some folks that are housed from a nearby district with us because there isn't motel capacity there. And so those numbers grew very quickly. We staff at one of the hotels 24/7, and so staff there are providing 3 meals a day and continuing to connect with folks and collect information and working on planning for what happens when folks are no longer in motels. Really anything that you could possibly think of, including, we check people's temperatures twice a day and we monitor for symptoms and we make sure that folks can get to treatment programs and to doctor's appointments. And so it's the services that we were providing, we are still providing to a much more significant number of people and spread out across motels versus in our typical shelter environment. And so the face of what we're doing looks really different and at the same time is very similar to what our work was before.
Can you explain how you go from roughly 20 people that you had housed after week 2 to something like 100? Where do the other 80 people, materialize from such that they come into the programming that you're providing?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. A little bit of everywhere. I mean, so the folks that we moved, our shelter wasn't quite full at that point. Usually the warming shelter is 33 beds. We moved some more people from our year-round shelter. We've seen people, like I said, who might have been in precarious housing situations, who needed additional spaces. We've seen people released from incarceration. It's kind of every place you could think of that somebody might not have had stable housing and a lease and kind of a space of their own, people have come from.
And so sorry to interrupt, but if someone shows up at your door or calls you guys, is there a policy that you'll serve anyone, or are there certain individuals who, Groundworks has to say, you know what, we can't deal with your particular situation? What's the threshold
Sure.
there?
Yeah, so folks, to get housing that isn't done directly through us, so folks call the Economic Services Office. So folks are funded through motel rooms through the state emergency housing program, which has relaxed guidelines right now. So typically this is not a time of the year that folks would be housed at. And so folks during the daytime are calling the state benefits center number and getting directed to the local office. And then they screen folks from there. And so they're working on where folks are coming from and why they need housing, and then refer them over. In the evening hours, if someone needs housing at night, then they call Vermont 211 and have the opportunity to talk to a benefit specialist about housing.
Okay, so a lot of people are being directed to you because they call the state, they don't know where else to turn, and then you're the provider in your region, so that's how they kind of funnel to you.
Yeah.
So, sometimes, we've had the motel program has been in the news over the years and has been modified 100 times in 10 years. I mean, it's kind of a never-ending policy journey with the motel program. Obviously, this is a different moment. Have you received any pushback locally where someone says, what the heck, putting people up at a motel, they get all their meals, the pool, why should we have people in, obviously not deluxe accommodations, but in these sort of, fairly, they're a step up from being in a bunk in a shelter where it's might be much tighter quarters. Do you get any of that kind of pushback? And then if so, what do you say back to explain why we're taking these extraordinary measures to put people in motel beds?
Sure. It's interesting. I think in typical times, there certainly is always a question of how we support people and why are people homeless and where do they come from, and a lot of different kind of opinions and beliefs. And as a provider, it's always hard because we can't share people's individual stories, which can be really impactful. And so we try to talk about it from more of a 30-foot view. I think we haven't heard a lot of that more recently. And in fact, I think it's kind of the opposite direction where, we don't have, this is a time of year where we typically see people start camping in our community, which has become a growing issue over the last few years. And we don't see that this year, which I think is really noticeable to folks. And I think instead, the frame that I've heard most frequently is that really people's housing needs are met. And while hotels are not permanent housing and they're not the solution, the fact that we have every single person in our community who otherwise was struggling with homelessness indoors and cared for, I think is really significant. And I think really speaks volumes to the fact that we know that homelessness is a challenge that can be solved and through a number of solutions. And although I am one of those people that would agree the motel program is not necessarily the ideal to ending homelessness, it is part of the solution. So across the housing continuum, it is one of the things that can help to get people indoors, supported by case managers, and then working on what the next steps for housing look like.
Well, I suspect that many people who might otherwise be critical or skeptical of the value proposition of putting people up in motels right now in light of Vermonters' general adherence to the stay-at-home order and a belief in the science and the need to pitch in on the public health front, probably recognize that from a public health point of view, it's safer both for the people who are in the motel, but everybody else, that they're in a safe place with some isolation and not commingling in the way that people who have nowhere else to go often do just for comfort and companionship. So that's good. I know that there is some discussion at the state level, and presumably Groundworks and other partner organizations around the state are trying to figure out how we use this moment to better understand how to successfully continue to house the 100 people in the Brattleboro area, and then the hundreds more all throughout the state. I believe there's about 1,600 throughout the state right now who are in a similar position, and wanting to make sure that while the reason they're housed is obviously not good, that we maybe find something positive to transition out of this with. So, we'll all cross our fingers and hope that our best efforts, produce that kind of value. How is the staff? You mentioned that some people right out of the gates were taken out of commission from the workforce because they might have been exposed. How has staffing been affected, if at all, since then in the last 6 weeks? Anybody who's tested positive, anyone who's been in contact and so had to be removed from their shifts? How's that gone?
Sure. We certainly have had some impact to staffing. We are through the support of our local hospital, we're able to offer mobile testing across the motel sites into our shelter. And so we've done not a huge number, but we've done a bit of mobile testing and have been extremely lucky that all the tests we've done have come back negative, and we have not had any staff members impacted. So we're really grateful for that. Certainly we've seen staff who have been sick, and because we have additional precautions, anyone who has a cough or sneeze, or they're staying home until they're feeling better, and so that can impact our staffing. And we've drastically expanded the services, the number of people that we're offering services to, and so we've continued to add new staff people, and we'll continue to do that to make sure that we're serving everyone.
How have community members played a role as you've dealt with the extra level of effort and the stress and the need for resources? I presume there are people, just like there are in my community, who wish to help in some way, and they've kind of scanned the community to find a good fit for them. Have community members on a volunteer basis played any role in helping you guys through this?
Absolutely. I think we wouldn't be doing this work without the support of community members. So our food shelf, as we drastically changed our shelter programs, our food shelf went to a delivery only model. And so volunteers are packing boxes, they're delivering boxes, they're taking calls of folks that are in need of food. We have volunteer cooks who are helping to prepare 3 meals a day at one of the hotel sites and then deliver food to other motel sites. We have volunteer support helping to staff programs. So it's a significant effort, and certainly there is a mix of Groundwork staff and community volunteers. And I think I couldn't underscore enough that without the support of our broad community in a variety of different ways, this would not look the way that it does and run as successfully. Kind of ironically, there's endless amounts of work, and at the same time, there's a lot of success in the work that we're doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that could go wrong, even with the best efforts put forward. And the fact that you guys sound like you've handled everything quite seamlessly it's a small miracle with lots of contributors. So it's great to hear community members have been able to kind of fill some of the need for more capacity to meet these people's particular challenges. Before I ask my last sort of substantive question for you, if people wanted to provide support to Groundworks at this point, what would be the thing that you need the most, or if they wanted to contribute monetarily to help offset some of the costs you've incurred? I'm going to give you the shameless pitch moment to.
It's shameless pitch. I mean, definitely continued volunteer support and certainly financial support as this work continues. I think we're feeling like we have our needs. We're continuing to work to meet our needs. They're met moment to moment. And as we look at how long this could stretch on, certainly the financial needs and implications of this are significant. And so folks can certainly find us on social media or through our website, which is groundworksvt.org, and hear more about our work and look at ways to contribute.
Well, as someone who was in the housing field for many years, working at Community Action and then subsequently at Cathedral Square, which provides affordable housing for seniors and people with disabilities, I can say that the need for both volunteer support, donations, and financial contributions, it makes a huge difference, because I'm going to make an assumption about the folks who work at Groundworks, which is that no one's making like 7 figures at Groundworks doing this work, not yet. And no one does it to get rich, and if you are, I suggest we'll do a financial counseling session some other time. But the money that comes in from outside helps support in so many ways that make the job easier, and frankly, help recognize that while you're not in it for the money, that there have to be sort of many hands helping, the work be successful, which is ultimately why people are into the work. So that's my shameless pitch on your behalf. So last question before we wrap. You're now, I suppose you're about 7 weeks now into the COVID-19 world. You've housed 100 people or more, unique people. You've also got all the food distribution. You've got other ancillary activities other than just housing people. Looking back at this point, any particular moments that stand out to you that, 2 years from now, you're going to look back and say, those were like the powerful experiences that I had that really define the memory for you?
I know I looked at this question earlier, and it's so hard to think of one or even just a few. I think, my takeaway in so much of this work is that this is community work. Supporting people and solving issues of homelessness are so much more than just Groundworks and staff, and at the same time, this is an agency that I love, and we have incredible folks that work here. And so watching everybody kind of pivot at a moment's notice, responding to my phone calls at 3:00 in the afternoon on a Saturday to say, by the way, we're going to just start relocating people from our shelter today. And by the way, we're going to change the food shelf to delivery only by Monday. And today's Sunday. And seeing the work that can happen, and to see our community members come together when we said, oh, and we need a homeless response team, and we need to start making plans for this. I think it's really the entire picture of how the work has pivoted and how people are supported, and the fact that, this is the weekend that we traditionally close our warming shelter and hand out tents, which is always such a bittersweet moment of, those 6 months in the winter are challenging and can end up in a lot of sleepless nights for everyone. And yet the fact that we're not sending people out to camp outdoors, and that this could lend us as a community and as a state to really look at how we deliver services, and, the irony of, in the midst of a global pandemic, that we could start to really implement solutions that could impact people's individual lives and collectively all of our communities is just not lost on me in any of this. So.
Well, it's well said. And it's funny how sometimes a crisis helps produce the imperative to take different approaches, and maybe even dust off approaches that had just been, people wouldn't employ for some reason, financial or ideological. But now we have this issue in front of us, and we maybe make some good out of a really terrible situation. So Rhianna, I want to thank you very much for all the work you're doing. Obviously, I thank you for joining me, but it's you and your peers out there who are doing the really heroic work. And I know that, as I said, you don't do it to be rich, you don't do it to be recognized, but, many other positions are, held in sort of more of a spotlight in times of crisis, but you are not, it's sort of behind the scenes in a way, because it's sight unseen, because people are being housed, and that doesn't mean it should be recognized any less. So thank you. Before we wrap for the night, I just want to again encourage people to support Groundworks, even if you don't live in Windham County. That doesn't mean that they couldn't benefit from your generosity. And then also remind you of two things tomorrow, 10:30, the full Senate will be meeting virtually. So anyone in the public can watch it in real time, where we'll be debating and hopefully passing a bill that will create a hazard pay bonus for about 30,000 Vermonters who are on the front lines and doing work that's put them at higher risk, and they don't make much money in the first place. And then second, at 2:30 tomorrow, there's going to be a full Senate discussion of a more informal nature with the Commissioner of Health, Mark Levine, to talk about contact tracing and increased testing throughout Vermont as we ease into the new, into the, as we ease the economic world back into normal, even if it's on a slow basis. So hope you'll consider checking out both of those and watch your government at work. Other than that, I will close by encouraging you to continue to follow the public health orders of our Department of Health, because the best thing you can do to support Rhianna and her coworkers and all the medical professionals is to do what the Commissioner of Health is saying, frankly. So good night, and I hope you continue to stay safe.